Hey guys, it's the Tominator, and now that I've got your attention with that somewhat provocative title, I wanted to talk a little bit about Phil Heath, one of the most undeservedly vilified bodybuilders in recent memory, of all time for that matter, because everything is amplified under the scrutiny of social media these days. So many people love to hate on this guy, man. Whether it's his gut or his arrogant personality or whatever the case may be, Phil's been getting all sorts of undue flack for years now. One criticism I see come up quite often is this idea that he only won so much because he competed in a relatively weak era, that if he were a bodybuilder, say back in the 90s, there's just no way he would have won. And in my opinion at least, this is a rather ridiculous claim. Now you gotta understand that the 90s was my favorite era too, by far. I think the depth of field back then was simply unparalleled and still regarded as the true golden era of bodybuilding. And not only that, but my three favorite bodybuilders all happen to come from that time period: Shawn Ray, Flex Wheeler, and Kevin Levrone. So suffice it to say, this video doesn't come from someone who's biased towards modern bodybuilding or just a Phil Heath fanboy or something like that. I am a fan of Phil, no doubt, but there's at least three other guys from the 90s who I liked even more. Objectively speaking, however, if we're considering how bodybuilding shows are actually judged, I'm pretty confident that Phil would have not only held his own against these guys, but that he actually would have come out on top more often than not. But before we proceed any further, let's just clarify a few things first. So, for the purposes of this fictional comparison, I'm going to be referring to Phil's physique as it looked in his prime, which was broadly speaking any time between 2008 and 2013. Before '08, he was simply too new and underdeveloped, and after 2014, his midsection became compromised and it threw off his whole flow. So while it's true that he continued to improve in certain areas like his back or legs, the overall package suffered because of the unsightly stomach distension and the herniated belly button. Now, you may be thinking that this is all fairly straightforward and trivial. Why bother pointing out the obvious? Well, because the thing is, if Phil had actually competed back in the 90s, he wouldn't have been as big and muscled as he is. That's just a given. Guys back then weren't taking as much stuff, and the insulin craze was just starting to catch on. So, on average, bodybuilders were quite a bit smaller than they are today, especially in the first half of the decade. So, I'm not going to bother speculating what Phil would have looked like had he been on a 90s era drug regimen, because at that point, we're just pulling stuff out of our ass. It's impossible to say for sure. Plus, it's not really the point. After all, the critics are arguing that Phil, as he is, wouldn't be good enough to win in the 90s. So let's get into this and start breaking it down, and we'll see. Who were the top contenders of the 90s? Obviously, the two foremost threats would have to be the reigning champs, Dorian Yates and Ronnie Coleman. And indeed, both of them would pose a serious problem for the smaller framed Phil Heath. But we'll save them for the end. For now, let's dispense with some of the pretenders, alright? First up is the ever popular Lee Priest. Lee was an amazing bodybuilder, no doubt. He had some of the best guns ever and a one-of-a-kind wow factor. But was he winning major titles? No. He never came close to winning an Arnold Classic, and his best finish at the Olympia was only 6th. Plus, he was very short and narrow. People are quick to condemn Phil for his narrow structure, but compared to Lee, he might as well have been Jay freaking Cutler. Next. Paul Dillette, another marquee name of the 90s and one of the first modern mass monsters. Dillette was a giant and looked so impressive, he could have easily been mistaken for Mr. Olympia while standing relaxed. But unfortunately, once he started posing, things fell apart pretty quickly. His back was also extremely weak, and he would have stood no chance next to Phil from the rear, even in most of the other mandatories for that matter, since his posing was so awkward and ineffectual. Next. Nasser El Sambadi. Now, here's someone who on paper would represent a serious threat to Phil. Nasser was much wider and more massive. At his best, he'd be a problem in poses like the front double biceps, side chest, and ab and thigh. I'm honestly not sure Phil would be able to win these shots. But again, when it comes to the conditioning and the back poses, the gift would absolutely mop the floor with him. As head judge Steve Weinberger likes to say, conditioning kills. And it would prove to be Nasser's undoing, since he was always smooth when they turned around. The way I'd sum it up is this. If Nasser couldn't manage to beat a one-armed, half-melted Dorian in 97, he's got literally no chance against the much more symmetrical and complete Phil Heath. Next, Chris Cormier, another guy with a definite structural advantage over Phil. Cormier was massive, dense, balanced, almost flawless at his peak. However, he never really had any standout body parts to draw your eye. And I've speculated in a past video that this may have been the reason why he never won an Arnold Classic, despite finishing runner-up at that show a record 6 times. Phil doesn't share this weakness. With his world-class triceps, forearms, and back, Heath would almost certainly overshadow even the best versions of Chris Cormier. It wouldn't be a cakewalk by any means, but if Chris couldn't beat Jay or Dexter at the biggest shows, then he likely wouldn't beat Phil either. Next, Andreas Munzer, the one man who could legitimately outcondition Phil hands down, as he outconditioned literally everyone else throughout history. The thing is, conditioning is important, but it's not all important. You still need the size and thickness to go along with it. And so despite being sliced and diced out of his mind, Munzer would get completely outclassed by Phil's mass and fullness. He was never really a top contender among the 90s lineups anyway, so I don't see any scenario where he could possibly pull off the upset here. Next. Okay, but enough with the appetizers, let's move on to the main course. And so we come to the big three. First up, Kevin Levrone. Of all the 90s bodybuilders, Kevin is perhaps the closest approximation to Phil in terms of the ridiculous roundness he was carrying, especially through those delts and triceps. They look almost like clones of one another in that hands clasped most muscular, and Kevin is one of the very few who could hope to potentially outdo Phil here. Same goes for the side chest. It would still be super close, but let's just say for the sake of argument, he manages to edge out Phil in both those poses. He would also take the front lat spread. But what else is he winning? Could he beat Phil in the front double biceps? I don't think so. The side tricep? Possibly. He looked more aesthetic maybe, but I would argue no on account of Phil's greater thickness, and Phil would also beat him in the lower body there. Kevin might be wider in the rear lat spread, but Phil is far more detailed and conditioned through the back and glutes. He also gets completely buried in the rear double biceps, and I'm not sure he would win the ab and thigh against these younger versions of Phil, given the size difference through the legs. So yeah, Kevin is very impressive and the steepest challenge so far, but I think Phil's superiority through the back and the lower body, and not to mention the notable advantage in conditioning, would put him firmly in the driver's seat here. The only time Levrone ever managed to come in as ripped as Phil was in 1992 when he was much smaller and leaner, in which case he'd get totally outmuscled by even a 2008 Phil Heath. Alright, let's move on to Shawn Ray, my favorite bodybuilder of all time, so you can bet who I'm rooting for in this matchup. King Kamali once likened Phil Heath to a bigger, better version of Shawn Ray. This was back at the 2011 Mr. Olympia, and you can best believe I was a little ticked off by that comment. Certainly Phil was bigger, but was he truly better? I'm not so sure even to this day. But what I am sure of is that going pose for pose, Shawn would get his clock cleaned. Phil was significantly bigger than Ray, measuring about 2 inches taller and outweighing him by roughly 30 to 40 pounds depending on the year. So no way is the much smaller Ray going to be able to hang with that. I would still award Shawn the ab and thigh, of course, and maybe the front lat spread just because Phil looks so scrunched in that one, but otherwise he's not winning anything. Of course, if we're scoring the posing round, then you'd have to think that Ray would at least take that, but then again, given that he couldn't beat even a relatively ungraceful and unaesthetic version of Ronnie Coleman in the 2001 free posing round, I think the judges might side with Phil even there. It's utterly idiotic how they judge that, seemingly just giving it to the guy they had in first all along, but hey, it is what it is, I guess. That's the IFBB for you. Okay, and now we come to the Sultan of Symmetry, Flex Wheeler, Phil's toughest opponent yet. Flex ain't no pushover, that's for sure. His major weakness was his narrowness, which also happens to be Phil's biggest weakness, so they almost cancel each other out there. With his ripped midsection and feathered quads, Flex would definitely win the ab and thigh. He also looked surprisingly good in the front lat spread, so he'd take that one too. And it would be very close in the front double, back double, and even the most muscular, since those latter two were some of Wheeler's strongest shots. But I'd ultimately have to probably side with Heath on those because even though Flex looks more aesthetic, Phil has the size advantage. And Phil would absolutely murder him in the side chest and rear lat spread, two of Flex's weakest poses. Plus, once again, Phil would kill him in the conditioning department, as Flex was notoriously soft through his hamstrings and glutes for the majority of his career. The only time where he was really peeled in those areas was in '93, but Phil would crush him size-wise there. So yeah, guys, sad to say, but Phil Heath would objectively defeat all three of my personal bodybuilding heroes in direct competition. You'd have to be blind or just oblivious to how these things are really judged to think otherwise. Now, again, we're talking in terms of a prime Phil Heath here, not a 2014, 2017, or 2018 Phil Heath with a big old bubble gut spilling over. Flex or Kevin at their best might be good enough to defeat those more flawed versions of Phil, especially given that Shawn Rhoden was able to do so in 2018. And Rhoden, as good as he looked that year, I think most people would agree is not on the same level as this trio of 90s legends. But again, that's not what we're talking about. So I don't want to hear you guys whining about all that in the comments section, okay? So this leaves us with only two potential saviors, Ronnie and Dorian. Let's first start with Dorian since he ruled throughout most of the 90s. There's two major advantages Yates has over Phil, width and hardness. Some might say conditioning or size, but I think that's a bit inaccurate, and here's why. Phil was pretty much just as conditioned as Yates in the sense of all the muscular detail and definition he displayed. They would each go back and forth depending on the body part. Could Heath's lower back compare to that jagged, razor-sharp Christmas tree in Dorian's back? No way. But then again, did Dorian ever have striated, sunken glutes like Phil? No, he didn't. Did Yates ever show feathering in his triceps or so many visible striations across his chest in the crab most muscular? See, the way I look at it is like this. They were both about equal in terms of conditioning. It was just a different kind of conditioning. Yates was definitely harder, denser, and grainier, whereas Phil was always a little more watery looking even when he was totally shredded. But Phil genetically has better separation than Yates, and more striated muscles as well. And even if you want to argue that Dorian was just outright more conditioned, that's fine, because Phil can counter with a fullness Yates could only dream of. See, the downside to getting so dry and peeled is that Dorian always tended to look fairly flat. His muscles never had much pop to them, and this allows Phil, to a large extent, to close the size gap between them. Yates had about an inch of height and several inches in width over Phil, and this would naturally help him in a lot of the mandatories. I think Phil would win the front double, the side chest, and the most muscular without a doubt, as these were Dorian's worst poses. Dorian would destroy him in the front lat spread, however, and would probably come out on top in the ab and thigh because of his better upper body taper. The rear lat spread, side triceps, and back double biceps would be too close to call. For my money, I'd give Phil the back double because of his better arms and symmetry, whereas Dorian would win the side triceps, despite Phil having way better triceps. Dorian's execution was just so masterful in that one, he transformed what should have been a mediocre pose into one of the best side tries in history. The rear lat spread could go either way depending on how much you value calves versus glutes and hamstrings, and width versus detail. But if we're going to give it to Dorian, it certainly wouldn't be a blowout. So overall, who's going to win in a head-to-head? My money would be on Phil, because I feel like Dorian was more flawed and would be exploited by a more complete and symmetrical bodybuilder. Remember, he never had to face anyone on this level. Since Kevin could never challenge him from the rear, Shawn was too small, and Flex Wheeler was too narrow and unconditioned. Phil Heath may still be too narrow, but otherwise he doesn't suffer from any of these limitations. So I think he would have pushed Dorian harder than anyone had he competed back in the 90s, and probably would have come out on top most of the time if we're being completely objective. Finally, this brings us to Ronnie Coleman. Now, for Ronnie, the only 2 years we're concerned with here are 98 and 99, since these were the only times he actually won the Olympia in the 90s. And we're not talking about the 2000s, remember, so never mind the 2001 Arnold Classic or '03 Olympia. In my opinion, this would be Phil Heath's greatest challenge. And I'm honestly not sure he'd be able to win, because Ronnie would neutralize or at least match almost all of Phil's strengths. Round, full muscle bellies? Check. Amazing arms, back, and legs? Check. Thickness from the side and rear? Check. Great conditioning? Check. About the only edge still remaining is Phil's greater level of completeness when we factor in the calves, and to a lesser extent the forearms and triceps. But at this point, Ronnie's symmetry was still intact, and he was arguably even more aesthetic than Phil too, and obviously a whole lot wider. I think the only poses Phil would have in the bag are the side triceps and ab and thigh. Front double and front lat spread would go to Ronnie. The side chest most muscular and both back shots would be pretty much a total toss-up depending on which versions and pictures we're comparing and your own subjective point of view. So yeah, I think about the only bodybuilder from the 90s that Phil couldn't likely beat would be Ronnie in 98 and 99. But even there, he might still pull it off. It'd be an awesome head-to-head battle, that's for sure. So to anybody who thinks Phil Heath only dominated the 2010s because his competition was weak, you're kidding yourselves, man. Even when we plunk him in the most stacked era in history alongside some of the greatest, most legendary physiques ever, the gift still wins a lot more than he loses. Yeah, guys, so let me know your thoughts on this one. I just wanted to make this video to basically shut up all the haters and 90s fanboys viewing everything through rose-colored lenses. And for the record, a lot of these same arguments could easily apply to Dexter or Kai Green as well. I think they'd also stack up extremely favorably in these 90s lineups, so it's not just a matter of me dick-riding Phil. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed, whether you agreed or not, and make sure to leave a like and hit that subscribe button for more if you haven't already. Until next time, this has been the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back!